Imagine moving into your dream home, only to find out your neighbor wants you gone because of your race. When Dr. Hakeem Howard, a black cardiologist, moved to Cedar Lake, he didn't expect to be greeted with a police visit. What sacrifices will Hakeem make to try and build a bridge with his hostile neighbor? If you're new, make sure to subscribe and join us in every new journey. Dr. Hakeem Howard, his wife Imani, and their daughter Emma pulled up to their new house in Cedar Lake, their faces beaming with excitement. The picturesque suburban neighborhood seemed perfect for their fresh start. As they unloaded boxes from the moving truck, laughter filled the air. Emma twirled on the front lawn, her braids swinging in the sunlight. But just next door, unseen by the happy family, Grace Campbell peered through her curtains. Her wrinkled face twisted into a scowl as she watched the new black family settling in. Grace's mind raced with prejudiced thoughts, her fingers gripping the windowsill tightly. "This neighborhood's going downhill," she muttered to herself. As the Howards continued unpacking, blissfully unaware of the tension brewing next door, Grace's jaw set with determination. She'd lived here for decades, and she wasn't about to let those people ruin her quiet street. With a huff, she turned away from the window, her mind made up. She was going to do something about these new neighbors, and soon. Little did the Howards know, their attempt to connect with their new community would spark an unexpected chain of events. How far would one neighbor go to preserve her idea of the perfect neighborhood? Dr. Hakeem Howard and his wife Imani stood in their new kitchen, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes. The warmth of the afternoon sun filtered through the windows, casting a golden glow on their excited faces. "I think we should throw a housewarming party," Imani suggested, her eyes twinkling with anticipation. "It'll be a great way to meet our neighbors and make some friends." Hakeem nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "That's a wonderful idea, honey. We could do a backyard barbecue, keep it casual and inviting." As they discussed the details, their daughter Emma skipped into the room, her braids bouncing with each step. "Can I help with the invitations?" she asked eagerly. The day of the party arrived, and the Howards' backyard was transformed. Colorful streamers hung from trees, and the aroma of grilled burgers and hot dogs filled the air. Laughter and chatter mingled with the soft melody of jazz playing in the background. Hakeem stood at the grill, flipping burgers and exchanging pleasantries with his new neighbors. Imani moved through the crowd, her nurse's instinct for making people feel at ease on full display. She introduced herself to each guest, her warm smile and genuine interest in their stories helping to break the ice. Emma darted between the adults, her infectious giggles drawing smiles from even the most reserved guests. As the party reached its peak, the Howards couldn't help but feel a sense of belonging. They exchanged knowing glances, silently celebrating the success of their gathering. This was exactly the kind of community they had hoped for when they chose Cedar Lake. Meanwhile, just next door, Grace Campbell paced in her dimly lit living room. The sounds of laughter and music from the Howards' party seemed to seep through her walls, grating on her nerves. She peered through her curtains, her lips pressed into a thin line as she watched the diverse group of people mingling in the yard next door. Grace's hands clenched and unclenched at her sides. Her mind raced with a jumble of thoughts, each more unsettling than the last. "This isn't right," she muttered to herself. "This isn't what Cedar Lake is supposed to be." The weight of decades of prejudice pressed down on her, clouding her judgment. As the party continued into the evening, Grace's agitation grew. She paced back and forth, debating what to do. The noise wasn't really that loud, and it wasn't particularly late. But in Grace's mind, the very existence of the party, and the family hosting it, was an affront to her neighborhood. Finally, with trembling hands, Grace picked up her phone. She hesitated for a moment, her finger hovering over the keypad. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, she dialed. "Hello, police?" I'd like to report a disturbance. The sun had just begun to set, casting long shadows across the Howards' backyard when the first police car pulled up. The cheerful atmosphere of the party evaporated instantly. Hakeem's easy smile faded as he watched two officers approach, their faces impassive. "Good evening, officers," Hakeem said, stepping forward to meet them. "Is there a problem?" "We received a noise complaint," one of the officers replied, his eyes scanning the gathering. "Mind if we take a look around?" A hush fell over the party as the officers made their way through the backyard. Imani hurried to Emma's side, pulling her close as they watched the scene unfold. The guests shifted uncomfortably, some beginning to gather their things to leave. Hakeem maintained his composure as he spoke with the officers, explaining that it was a housewarming party and that they hadn't realized they were causing any disturbance. The officers, finding no real issue, soon left with a warning to keep the noise down. As the last police car pulled away, Hakeem and Imani exchanged a look of disbelief and disappointment. The party had come to an abrupt end, their hopes for a warm welcome to the neighborhood shattered. Unbeknownst to the Howards, Grace watched from her window, a mixture of satisfaction and unease on her face. She had won this small battle, but as she observed the hurt and confusion on her new neighbors' faces, a tiny seed of doubt began to take root in her mind. Grace's call to the police was meant to drive the Howards away, but it had the opposite effect. Could acts of kindness overcome years of ingrained bias? The answer would surprise everyone involved, including Grace herself. In the days following the ill-fated housewarming party, Hakeem and Imani sat at their kitchen table, cups of coffee cooling between them as they discussed their next move. The weight of disappointment hung heavy in the air, but determination shone in their eyes. "We can't let this define our experience here," Hakeem said, his voice firm. "We chose Cedar Lake for a reason. It's our home now." Imani nodded, reaching across to squeeze her husband's hand. "You're right, but how do we handle Grace? She clearly doesn't want us here." They fell silent for a moment, contemplating the challenge before them. It was Imani who spoke first, a spark of inspiration in her voice. "What if we kill her with kindness? Show her we're not the threat she thinks we are." Hakeem's eyebrows raised, a slow smile spreading across his face. "You know, that might just work. It's worth a try, at least." Over the next few weeks, the Howards launched their charm offensive. It started with small gestures, a friendly wave whenever they saw Grace outside, offering to bring in her trash cans when the garbage truck came by. Each time, Grace responded with a cold stare or a curt nod before retreating into her house. Undeterred, they escalated their efforts. One sunny Saturday morning, Imani baked a batch of her famous blueberry muffins. The scent of warm, buttery pastry filled their kitchen as she arranged them on a plate. "Ready?" she asked Hakeem, who nodded, taking a deep breath. Together, they walked next door, Emma trailing behind them curiously. Hakeem knocked on Grace's door, the plate of muffins held out like a peace offering. After a long moment, the door creaked open. Grace stood there, her thin frame tense, eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Good morning, Mrs. Campbell," Hakeem said warmly. "We thought you might enjoy some freshly baked muffins." Grace's gaze flicked from the muffins to their faces and back again. Without a word, she reached out, took the plate, and shut the door in their faces. Hakeem and Imani exchanged glances, their smiles faltering. Behind them, Emma's small voice piped up. "Why doesn't she like us, Mommy?" The question hit them like a punch to the gut. Imani knelt down, pulling Emma into a hug. "Sometimes, sweetie, people are afraid of what they don't understand. But we're going to keep trying to show her there's nothing to be afraid of." As weeks turned into months, the Howards continued their campaign of kindness. They offered to help with yard work when they saw Grace struggling with her lawnmower. They invited her to Emma's birthday party. Each time, Grace rebuffed them with increasing hostility. "Go back where you came from," she snapped one day when Hakeem offered to help her carry groceries. "I don't need your help or your pity." The words stung, but Hakeem kept his composure. "We're not going anywhere, Mrs. Campbell. This is our home too." Behind closed doors, the constant rejection took its toll. Imani found Hakeem sitting on their bed one night, his head in his hands. "Maybe we should just give up," he said, his voice heavy with defeat. "Nothing we do seems to make a difference." Imani sat beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "We can't give up, Hakeem. We're not just doing this for us. We're doing it for Emma, for every family that might come after us. We have to believe that love can overcome hate." Hakeem looked at his wife, drawing strength from her unwavering resolve. He nodded, straightening his shoulders. "You're right. We've faced tougher challenges than this. We'll keep trying." As night fell on Cedar Lake, an eerie silence settled over the neighborhood. But beneath the calm surface, a life-altering moment was about to unfold. What unexpected event would shatter the tension between Hakeem and Grace? The clock ticked past midnight as Dr. Hakeem Howard's car pulled into his driveway. Exhaustion weighed heavily on his shoulders after a grueling shift at the hospital. He stepped out of the car, the cool night air a welcome relief after hours in the sterile environment of the emergency room. As he walked towards his front door, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He turned, squinting into the darkness. Something seemed off about Grace's house next door. The porch light, usually on at this hour, was dark. Then he saw it, a shadowy shape on the ground near Grace's front steps. Hakeem's fatigue vanished in an instant, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. He sprinted across the lawn, his heart pounding. As he drew closer, his worst fears were confirmed. Grace lay crumpled on her porch, unmoving. "Mrs. Campbell?" Hakeem called out, kneeling beside her. "Can you hear me?" There was no response. Hakeem's training kicked in automatically. He checked for breathing, felt for a pulse. Both were present, but weak and irregular. Without hesitation, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. "This is Dr. Hakeem Howard. I need an ambulance at 1423 Maple Street immediately. Elderly female, unconscious, possible cardiac event." As he relayed the information to the dispatcher, Hakeem's mind raced. All the months of hostility, the cold stares, the hurtful words. None of it mattered now. In this moment, Grace wasn't his prejudiced neighbor. She was his patient, and she needed his help. Hakeem began chest compressions, counting under his breath. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, fighting to save the life of a woman who had made it clear she didn't want him in her neighborhood. But there was no hesitation in his actions, no hint of resentment in his determined expression. Minutes stretched like hours as Hakeem worked tirelessly. In the distance, he heard the wail of approaching sirens. Relief flooded through him as the ambulance pulled up, bathing the street in flashing red and blue lights. Paramedics rushed from the vehicle, their faces set in professional concentration. Hakeem quickly briefed them on Grace's condition, helping them transfer her onto a stretcher. As they loaded her into the ambulance, Hakeem made a split-second decision. "I'm coming with you," he told the lead paramedic. "I'm a cardiologist." The ride to the hospital was a blur of activity. Hakeem worked alongside the paramedics, monitoring Grace's vital signs, administering medication. He pushed aside his exhaustion, focused solely on keeping his patient alive. As they rushed through the emergency room doors, Hakeem felt a mix of emotions he couldn't quite name. Relief that Grace had made it this far, worry about what lay ahead, and a strange sense of purpose. Whatever happened next, he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. The emergency room buzzed with activity as Hakeem handed over Grace's care to the ER team. But as the adrenaline faded, a nagging question emerged. How would Grace react when she realized the very person she despised had saved her life? Hakeem stood at the nurse's station, briefing the attending physician on Grace's condition. His voice remained steady and professional, but his mind raced with conflicting emotions. He'd spent months trying to win over this woman who seemed determined to hate him, and now here he was, fighting to save her life. "We're looking at a possible myocardial infarction," Hakeem explained, pointing to the ECG results. "I've started her on anticoagulants and ordered a full panel of cardiac enzymes." The attending physician nodded, impressed by Hakeem's quick thinking and thorough approach. As they discussed treatment options, Hakeem felt a strange mix of pride in his medical skills and unease about the personal complications of the situation. Hours passed as Grace underwent tests and treatment. Hakeem found himself pacing the waiting room, unable to leave despite his exhaustion. He'd called Imani to let her know what had happened, and she'd offered to come to the hospital. But Hakeem had declined, feeling he needed to see this through on his own. Finally, a nurse approached him. "Dr. Howard, Mrs. Campbell is stable and regaining consciousness. Would you like to see her?" Hakeem took a deep breath, steeling himself for what might come next. He followed the nurse to Grace's room, his footsteps echoing in the quiet corridor. As he entered, Grace's eyes fluttered open. Confusion clouded her face as she took in her surroundings. Then her gaze landed on Hakeem, and her expression shifted to one of shock and disbelief. What are you doing here?" Grace's voice was weak, but the familiar hostility still tinged her words. Hakeem approached her bedside, keeping his voice calm and professional. "Mrs. Campbell, you had a heart attack. I found you unconscious outside your home and called for an ambulance. You're in the hospital now, and you're going to be okay." Grace's eyes widened as the information sank in. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, clearly struggling to reconcile her prejudice with the reality of her situation. Hakeem continued, explaining her condition and the treatment she'd received. He kept his tone neutral, focusing on the medical facts rather than their personal history. As he spoke, he noticed Grace watching him intently, her expression a mix of confusion and something he couldn't quite identify. Was it gratitude, shame, or just the disorientation of her ordeal? You saved my life?" Grace finally managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Hakeem paused, choosing his words carefully. "I did what any doctor would do, Mrs. Campbell. Your health and well-being are what matter most." An awkward silence fell between them. Grace's gaze dropped to her hands, fidgeting with the edge of her blanket. Hakeem could almost see the internal struggle playing out on her face as she grappled with the cognitive dissonance of owing her life to someone she'd treated with such disdain. After a moment, Grace spoke again, her voice trembling slightly. "I don't understand. After everything, why would you help me?" Hakeem felt a surge of emotion, frustration, compassion, and a glimmer of hope all mixed together. He took a deep breath before responding. "Mrs. Campbell, when I took my Hippocratic oath, I swore to treat all patients with care and respect, regardless of who they are or what they believe. That's not just a professional obligation for me, it's a personal value. I became a doctor to help people, all people." He paused, letting his words sink in. "I know we've had our differences, but in that moment, you weren't my difficult neighbor. You were someone who needed help, and I was in a position to provide it. It's as simple as that." Grace's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, seemingly at a loss for words. Hakeem continued his explanation of her condition and the recovery process ahead. As he spoke, he noticed a subtle shift in Grace's demeanor. The hostility that had always been present in her eyes when she looked at him seemed to have softened, replaced by a mix of confusion and something that looked almost like remorse. As he finished his explanation, Hakeem prepared to leave, giving Grace time to rest and process everything that had happened. But as he turned to go, he heard her voice, softer than he'd ever heard it before. "Dr. Howard, thank you." Hakeem paused at the door, looking back at Grace. For the first time since they'd met, he saw her not as an adversary, but as a vulnerable human being. He nodded, offering a small smile. "You're welcome, Mrs. Campbell. Get some rest. I'll check on you again tomorrow." As Hakeem left Grace's room, a flicker of hope ignited. But could a single act of kindness truly melt years of prejudice? Grace's recovery would test not just her physical strength, but the deeply rooted beliefs that had defined her for decades. The days following Grace's heart attack were a whirlwind of medical procedures and careful monitoring. Hakeem found himself checking on her more frequently than his other patients, driven by a mix of professional duty and personal investment. Each time he entered her room, he braced himself for the possibility of encountering the old Grace, bitter, hostile, and unwelcoming. But something had shifted. The walls Grace had built around herself seemed to have cracked, if not completely crumbled. She was still reserved, often averting her eyes when Hakeem spoke, but the open hostility had vanished. In its place was a palpable sense of uncertainty, as if Grace herself wasn't quite sure how to navigate this new dynamic. As Grace's physical condition improved, Hakeem noticed her grappling with something deeper. During his visits, he'd catch her watching him with a furrowed brow, her lips pursed as if holding back words she wasn't ready to speak. The internal struggle was evident in her eyes, a battle between long-held prejudices and the undeniable reality of Hakeem's care and compassion. One afternoon, as Hakeem was explaining the next steps in her treatment plan, Grace interrupted him. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. "Dr. Howard, I don't understand why you're being so kind to me, after everything I have done." Hakeem paused, carefully considering his response. "Mrs. Campbell, my job, my calling, is to help people, all people. Regardless of our past interactions, you're my patient, and your well-being is my primary concern." Grace nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I've been so wrong about you, about a lot of things." She took a shaky breath. "I don't know if I can ever make up for how I've treated you and your family, but I want you to know. I'm grateful, not just for saving my life, but for showing me what true character looks like." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Hakeem felt a surge of emotion, relief, hope, and a cautious optimism. He maintained his professional demeanor, but allowed a small smile to cross his face. "Thank you, Mrs. Campbell. That means a lot to hear." As the days passed, Grace's progress continued, both physically and emotionally. She began asking Hakeem about his family, showing genuine interest in their lives. The conversations were sometimes awkward, punctuated by long pauses as Grace struggled to find the right words or caught herself falling into old patterns of thought. But the effort was undeniable. Hakeem, for his part, remained cautiously optimistic. He'd seen patients have epiphanies during health crises before, only to revert to old behaviors once the immediate danger had passed. Still, he couldn't deny the profound change in Grace's demeanor. One morning, as Hakeem was finishing his rounds, Grace called out to him just as he was about to leave her room. "Dr. Howard?" Her voice was tentative, almost shy. "I was wondering, would it be possible for me to speak with your wife and daughter? I think I owe them an apology too." Hakeem felt a rush of emotions, surprise, hope, and a touch of protectiveness. He studied Grace's face, searching for any sign of insincerity. Finding none, he nodded slowly. "I'll talk to them, Mrs. Campbell. I'm sure they'd be willing to visit." As he left the room, Hakeem's mind raced with the possibilities this request represented. Could this be the turning point they'd been hoping for? A chance to build a real relationship with their neighbor, free from the burden of prejudice? He knew better than to expect miracles. Years of ingrained beliefs wouldn't disappear overnight. But as he walked down the hospital corridor, Hakeem allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this was the first step towards the kind of community they dreamed of when they moved to Cedar Lake. One where differences were celebrated rather than feared, and where kindness could triumph over hate. The road to reconciliation is often paved with small gestures. For the Howards and Grace, it began with a dinner invitation. But as they prepared to sit down together, one question hung in the air. Can shared food heal a divide that runs so deep? Weeks after Grace's release from the hospital, the Howards stood on her porch, a homemade casserole in Imani's hands. The tension was palpable as they waited for the door to open. When it did, Grace greeted them with a hesitant smile, her eyes darting nervously between their faces. "Please come in," she said, her voice softer than they'd ever heard it before. The Howards stepped inside, taking in the cozy living room with its floral wallpaper and faded family photos. As they settled around Grace's dining table, an awkward silence fell over the group. Hakeem cleared his throat, searching for a way to break the ice. "The house looks lovely, Mrs. Campbell," he offered. Grace nodded, her hands fidgeting with her napkin. "Thank you. I'm glad you could come." The conversation started slowly, punctuated by long pauses and hesitant glances. But as they began to eat, something shifted. Emma, oblivious to the adults' discomfort, chatted happily about her favorite subjects at school. Grace's eyes softened as she listened to the little girl. "You know, I used to be a teacher," she said, surprising everyone. "3rd grade, I loved it." Emma's face lit up. "Really? That's so cool? What was your favorite thing to teach?" As Grace began to share stories from her teaching days, the tension in the room eased. Hakeem and Imani exchanged glances, a glimmer of hope passing between them. The conversation flowed more freely as the meal progressed. They discovered shared interests. Grace and Imani both loved gardening, while Hakeem and Grace found common ground discussing classic films. Laughter filled the room when Grace recounted a humorous mishap from her early teaching days. For a moment, it was easy to forget the months of hostility that had preceded this evening. As Imani helped clear the dishes, Grace's expression grew serious. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly. I owe you all an apology," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The room fell silent, all eyes on Grace as she continued. "The way I treated you when you moved in, it was inexcusable. I let fear and ignorance cloud my judgment. I'm so ashamed of my behavior." Tears welled up in Grace's eyes as she spoke. "You've shown me nothing but kindness, even when I was at my worst. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know how sorry I am." Hakeem and Imani exchanged glances, a mix of emotions playing across their faces. After a moment, Imani reached out and covered Grace's hand with her own. "We appreciate your apology, Grace. It takes courage to admit when you've been wrong." Hakeem nodded, his voice gentle. "We all make mistakes. What matters is that we learn from them and try to do better." Emma, sensing the gravity of the moment, piped up. Does this mean we can be friends now? A chuckle rippled through the room, breaking the tension. Grace smiled through her tears. I'd like that very much, Emma. As the evening drew to a close, there was a sense of new beginnings in the air. Grace walked them to the door, pausing before they stepped outside. I was thinking, she said hesitantly, maybe we could do this again, sometime. Perhaps I could show Imani my garden. Imani's face lit up. I'd love that, Grace. They said their goodbyes, the atmosphere vastly different from when they'd arrived. As the Howards walked back to their house, Hakeem squeezed Imani's hand. Well, that went better than I could have hoped, he said softly. Imani nodded, a thoughtful expression on her face. It's a start, she replied. We've still got a long way to go, but it's definitely a start. A single conversation can change a life, but can it transform an entire community? As Grace and the Howards took their first steps toward friendship, the rest of Cedar Lake watched with a mix of curiosity and apprehension. The stage was set for a social experiment none of them had signed up for. In the weeks following their dinner together, subtle changes began to ripple through Cedar Lake. Grace, once the self-appointed gatekeeper of the neighborhood, now found herself in an unexpected role: advocate for the Howards. It started small, with Grace mentioning Hakeem's medical expertise to her bridge club, or praising Imani's gardening skills to fellow plant enthusiasts at the local nursery. At first, her neighbors reacted with skepticism. They'd heard Grace's previous complaints about the Howards, and this sudden change in tune raised eyebrows. But Grace was persistent. She invited the Howards to neighborhood gatherings, introducing them with genuine warmth and enthusiasm. You simply must try Imani's lemon bars, Grace would say, steering people towards the Howards at potlucks. And did you know Dr. Howard volunteers at the free clinic downtown? He's doing wonderful work there. Slowly, the ice began to thaw. Neighbors, who had initially kept their distance, started engaging with the Howards, finding common ground over shared interests and experiences. The change was most evident in the children of Cedar Lake. Emma, once hesitant and withdrawn at neighborhood events, now ran and played freely with her peers. One sunny afternoon, Hakeem and Imani sat on their porch, watching Emma laugh with a group of kids on the sidewalk. Remember when she used to cling to us at these things? Imani said softly, a mix of joy and lingering sadness in her voice. Hakeem nodded, squeezing his wife's hand. It's amazing how quickly kids can adapt when given the chance. Adults, we're the ones who make it complicated. As summer turned to fall, Cedar Lake buzzed with a new energy. The annual block party, once a tense affair for the Howards, became a celebration of the neighborhood's growing diversity. Grace, to everyone's surprise, spearheaded the planning committee. We need to make sure everyone feels welcome, she insisted at meetings. That's what community is all about. The day of the block party arrived, and Cedar Lake was transformed. Streamers and balloons decorated the street, and the air was filled with the tantalizing aroma of various cuisines. Hakeem manned the grill, chatting easily with neighbors who now greeted him by name. Imani led a group of children in face painting, her artistic skills drawing admiration from parents. As the sun began to set, Grace clinked her glass, calling for everyone's attention. The crowd fell silent, curious about what their eldest resident had to say. Friends and neighbors, Grace began, her voice trembling slightly. I want to thank you all for making this our best block party yet. But more importantly, I want to thank you for opening your hearts and minds to change. She paused, her eyes finding the Howards in the crowd. A year ago, I stood in the way of progress. I let fear and ignorance cloud my judgment. But thanks to the kindness and persistence of the Howard family, I've learned that our differences are what make us strong. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, Grace continued, her voice growing stronger. Cedar Lake is changing, and it's changing for the better. Let's commit to being a community that welcomes all, that celebrates our diversity, and that stands together in the face of prejudice. The applause that followed was thunderous. As Hakeem and Imani hugged Grace, tears glistening in their eyes, they felt the weight of months of struggle and uncertainty lift from their shoulders. Later that night, as they tucked Emma into bed, she asked sleepily, "Do we belong here now, Mommy and Daddy?" Hakeem and Imani exchanged glances, their hearts swelling with emotion. "Yes, sweetheart," Imani replied, smoothing Emma's hair. "We've always belonged here. It just took some time for everyone to see it." The journey of the Howards and Grace Campbell, from hostility to friendship, stands as a testament to the power of compassion and persistence. What began as a clash of prejudice and fear transformed into a heartwarming story of personal growth and community healing. Grace's near-death experience and Hakeem's unwavering commitment to his duty as a doctor became the catalyst for change. This pivotal moment sparked a chain reaction of kindness that rippled through Cedar Lake, challenging long-held biases and opening hearts and minds. The story of Cedar Lake reminds us that building inclusive communities is an ongoing process. It requires courage, empathy, and a willingness to confront our own biases. As we reflect on this transformation, we're encouraged to examine our own prejudices and consider how small acts of kindness might create positive change in our lives and communities.